Conference 1, The Life, Thought, and Works of Meister Eckhart. And as we begin, let us just take a moment to entrust our reflections to the Lord, that He might help us to integrate what we have to say in a way that's going to be of benefit in our own lives. Meister Eckhart. We could begin by asking something about the title, the name Meister. In German, Meister, in English, Master, in Latin, Magister. Why is he known as Meister Eckhart? No one else in the history of Christian spirituality and mysticism was known in that way. We've had others who are known as greats, such as St. Albert the Great, whom Meister Eckhart would have known, Gregory the Great. We can ask, well, why are they known as great, when indeed others like Augustine and Aquinas, who were probably the two greatest theologians in the Christian tradition, never acquired that title, the Great. And so why is Eckhart known as the Master, the Meister? It says something at least about how people respected him, appreciated him, understood him, that he has gone down in history in some ways as the master of the spiritual life. Clearly, he was more than a master in the spiritual life. He was also a professor and in many ways an administrator, much of his life being occupied with those ministries as well. But yet, when it comes to understanding his role in the history of mysticism, he has that kind of preeminent place. Another thing that we should say is that he is a Dominican. That is, early in his life, in his mid-teens, he already joined the Order of Preachers, which is the order in which Thomas Aquinas had been a member, and Albert the Great, and of course founded by St. Dominic, and the ethos or the spirituality associated with those friars, those preaching friars, would have a tremendous influence on Eckhart as well. There's a lot we do not know about the life of Eckhart, which is strange, given how his reputation as a master has come down to us. But he was born in 1260, the latter part of the 13th century, although many of the dates that I give you cannot be precise. They might vary by a year or two depending upon whom you might read, just because many dates are not easy to pin down with respect to his life. He was born in Germany, and again, that context, German mysticism, helps us or will help us to appreciate him, because in Germany at the time, late 13th and in the 14th century, there was a tremendous proliferation and flowering of mysticism and mystical thought, not only in religious communities, but also among the laity. There would have been at the time of Eckhart, in the 14th century, a movement known as the Friends of God. Not a formal movement, but there were those many connected with each other who might even sign a letter, a friend of God. And Eckhart was in some ways a kind of spiritual father for that Friends of God movement. Likewise, some of the, if you wish, disciples of Eckhart, two Dominicans in particular, Johannes Tauler, or John Tauler, Heinrich or Henry Suso, two quite well-known mystical writers as well, very influenced by the thought of Eckhart, and they continued to have their influence throughout the centuries. But particularly in Germany at the time, a wide proliferation of communities of women or women recognized for their mystical life. We can think of someone today well-known, Hildegard of Bingen, earlier than Eckhart, but it reflects that among the laity, and especially among women at that time, there is a growing appreciation in some ways for the kind of mysticism that was being nourished in Dominican circles, which in many ways had a intellectual or studied aspect to it, and yet touched deeply, you could say, the life of the soul. And so the beguines would be associations of women, lay women, but women coming together to live a more deeply spiritual life. often gathering together in a béguinage, not as a formal religious community, not as a monastery, not juridically formed in any way, but nevertheless coming together, living a life of much more simplicity and poverty, and yet given to active works of charity. These women, nuns, as well as the Beguines, as well as others, would be those that, especially later in his life, Eckhart's ministry would be very much involved with. Anyway, in his mid-teens, he joins the Order of Preachers, and the program of study for him is going to be fairly similar to what any Dominican at that time would have undergone, probably 8 years of study, first initial studies and then theology. Some of that may have been done in Paris, but certainly the theological study, and most of it, would have happened in Cologne. In fact, we could keep in mind some of the cities with which Eckhart is going to be very much associated. Paris, certainly, because he will go and teach there, but especially otherwise Strasbourg and Cologne, that whole Rhineland kind of area. After his period of study, he is sent by the order to teach in Paris, which again shows the esteem, the recognition that he was chosen among all to go and actually be a lecturer in Paris, where he lectured on the sentences, what were known as the sentences of Peter Lombard, which would have been the classic text in many ways. At that time, in any theological study, a person began as a teacher by really lecturing on the sentences of Lombard. And at that point, one would not be teaching in his own right, but in a way almost more as what we might think of even as a teaching assistant almost, or a bachelor in some ways under the supervision of a master. But Eckhart is only there for a year before he's elected prior, which would be, again, a superior of a local Dominican community, prior in Erfurt, and also a kind of vicar of the master for that area of Germany in Thuringia. This indicates, again, another level of respect at a young age. Here he would be around 34 years old, chosen for this responsible role of leadership, pastoral administration, one might say. So we see his life in the beginning going back and forth between the recognition of his scholastic or academic gifts as a professor and teacher, being in a way intertwined with being called to more administrative, pastoral, and leadership roles. Both of these very active when we think of the kind of mystic that he is, or the mysticism that we associate with him. His contemplative life certainly was not in that sense a withdrawal from the world, but a very strong engagement in the world. After those terms or years as prior, he is again sent to Paris, but this time he is there as a magister, that is, one really teaching in his own right. But again, there in Paris only for about a year before he becomes the first provincial, which would be again a higher level administrative responsibility, the first provincial for a newly formed province in northern Germany, the province of Saxony, where he is for a number of years, towards the end of which he's also elected provincial of another German province, that of Teutonia, but the order decides to have him not accept that responsibility in order to send him back to Paris again. So this is the second time he would be in Paris as a magister, really his third time teaching in Paris. It's interesting in the fact that only Thomas Aquinas previously would have been someone who had had 2 terms as regent master, as it would have been known, at the University of Paris. So on all accounts, in wide varieties of ways, we see the order recognizing the variety of his gifts, which might give us, again, pause and appreciation of why he would be known as the master. But it's after this time in Paris that he returns to the Rhineland area. We're now talking about, say, the year 1313 or so. And he returns first to Strasbourg, where he's going to spend about 10 years. And after that, he returns to Cologne. These years become extremely significant because what we often really associate with Eckhart will be his preaching in the context of this flowering of mysticism in those areas of Strasbourg and Cologne. Many of his sermons there are given to nuns, cloistered nuns in monasteries, but also to these other groups for whom he was something of a spiritual guide, and indeed had been entrusted and asked by the order to serve something as a spiritual guide for these, we could say, really women's movements at that time. If we take a pause for a moment just to take a look at some of his written works and then come back to the latter years of his life, what we perhaps today are most familiar with might be what are called his German sermons, the sermons that he preached in the vernacular in Strasbourg and Cologne to these particularly women religious or lay women, other groups, friends of God. Those that were recorded, they're not sermons that he wrote, but they got recorded in great detail. And we have those German works today, 86 really of those sermons. And much of what we say in these conferences will be based upon those German sermons. In addition, he wrote 4 treatises, little short treatises in German, but otherwise his works would be in Latin, which would have been common at the time. What is more maybe unusual is that we have these works in the vernacular, because anyone writing theology as such would have written in Latin at the time. And so we have there a variety of sermons as well, many biblical commentaries that he wrote. Perhaps the one best known is his commentary in the Gospel of John, as well as some other disputed questions known as the Parisian questions, and a major work of his that he would have seen as in 3 parts that we really no longer have, and it was probably never finished. So that during the course of these varied ministries, we find commentaries on Scripture, theological works, preachings, but what has perhaps made him especially today well known and sought after in terms of his spiritual wisdom would be the German sermons, which we find him preaching as he returns to the Rhineland area and is involved very much, let's say, with the pastoral care of these mystical currents and women's movements and those kinds of things. Towards the end of this time in Strasbourg, after about 10 years, and in a way, you could imagine 10 years of preaching in that area. Now there's large numbers of monasteries of Dominican nuns. It's an amazing how they proliferated, in Strasbourg, in Cologne, as well as the number of béguinages in that sense, that just in Cologne itself at this time, there emerged about 40 of these different associations, béguinages of women. And so there was certainly the need for what Eckhart was doing, but at the same time, his continual deepening reflection, how often might some of them have heard him preach over and over again, and thus his effort to go more and more deeply into some of the major themes that we'll see during the course of these conferences. But he then is asked to go back to Cologne around the year, say, 1322, 23, 24. Again, dates are very difficult to pin down precisely in that regard. And to take charge there of, again, the Studium Generale that Albert the Great had established and that he himself would have been a part of as a student. Again, indicating the respect that the order manifested in terms of his abilities. However, sadly, we have to say, I suppose, that these last couple years of his life were fraught with much difficulty. Here we have a man with a professorial career, having taught as a master at least twice at the University of Paris, someone recognized in the order, called to be prior and then provincial, and elected a provincial another time when the order asked him not to proceed with that, but to rather return to teaching in Paris. And then these years of preaching in Strasbourg, But for whatever reasons, we won't go into the details, it gets complicated, a conflict emerges with the Archbishop of Cologne. The Archbishop there, who's a powerful figure, Henry of Wurtemberg, and a process begins whereby Eckhart comes under suspicion. Now, some of this has to do with the fact that a couple Dominicans themselves in Cologne, perhaps out of envy or whatever reason, begin to speak in terms of some detraction, even raising voices of unorthodoxy with respect to his thought. The Archbishop of Cologne, Henry, taking that kind of thing, heresy, extremely seriously at the time. It was a time in which there was much concern about the delicate balance between, or the line between, orthodoxy and unorthodoxy in terms of what one might find in some of the lay movements. And even back when Eckhart had gone to Paris the second time, that in 1310, in Paris, Marguerite of Porret had been burned at the stake because of an inquisition and judging hers. Again, today, many might say her thought was certainly orthodox, or others might question it. But the Archbishop, anyway, was very concerned about this. And so he initiates a process to investigate whether Eckhart's teaching is orthodox. Now, also entering into it are many political details in terms of the disruptions in German life and the Holy Roman Empire, and whom the Pope himself might find as the one that would be supportive or not supportive of him, and the Pope needing in some ways the support of someone like the Archbishop of Cologne. Also tensions that are there between the Franciscans and Dominicans that had emerged over time. And so many of those judging the case of Eckhart in Cologne were Franciscan. Again, one can't really place blame, but what emerges is certainly that his teaching comes under a cloud after a tremendous life and career. Comes under a cloud. Eckhart defends himself, but eventually the Archbishop himself condemns some of the teachings of Eckhart. Eckhart denies that the Archbishop has the authority to do this. In fact, Eckhart is right in that regard. As a member of the order, he's not subject in that way to the Archbishop. And in fact, the order itself, prior to perhaps wanting to stave off this kind of thing or solve whatever accusations were in the air, had its own investigation and had completely absolved Eckhart of any false teaching. But Eckhart says that he wants to have the case taken to Rome, which really at that time would have meant Avignon, because the Pope, John the 22nd, resided in Avignon. And so Eckhart takes the case there. But as it unfolds during that time, Eckhart himself says that if there's anything he's taught that is false, he would be able to deny it. But he considered what he had taught true. And today, I would say, everyone judges that his thought is orthodox. You know, at the time, of course, as we will see, there are some bold statements, maybe risky ways of stating something or putting something, but he dies while in Avignon, although we can't say, we don't even know today where he's buried, but it's during the course of that trial before it's resolved. And it's then after his death, about a year after he died, that Pope John the 22nd brings it to a close. And some 28 articles, almost all of which are from Eckhart's writings, are condemned. And so it brings his thought under a cloud at the time, and perhaps that's part of the reason why there are facets of his life that we no longer are so familiar with. On the other hand, today, his thought has been rehabilitated in so many different ways, and people would generally say, one, he had never actually been condemned as a heretic himself. Even the promulgation of those particular propositions taken from his thought were only promulgated in the Archdiocese of Cologne. In other words, only there so that the Archbishop himself might be satisfied with the completion of the process. And all of those people would recognize today are statements as it would have been done at the time, in many ways taken out of context. So you'll see as we go through some of these conferences that there are some statements that will just sound extremely risky or bold if you just take them at a certain face value without putting them in the context of the entirety of his thought. So, Eckhart, the Meister, Dominican, teacher, preacher, and pastoral administrator, highly respected, and yet his life ends in that way in something of a cloud. What are some of the major themes in his mystical thought, in his preaching? These will emerge in our next 5 conferences. Certainly the nobility, we might say, of the soul. That's something we'll talk about in the next conference. And the birth of God, the birth of the Word in the soul, perhaps in a sense, is major theme in many ways, in which the emphasis is on not only the nobility of the soul, but our union with God, our coming into union with the divine, our coming in some ways to an acknowledgement of our own divinity. And the process through which this takes place, especially in what Eckhart calls detachment. I prefer maybe to say detachment. His German word Abgeschiedenheit, which we'll say more about as well. But then the question of how does this all fit into how Eckhart himself would have understood who God is, because that's where some of his most, we might want to say, even outrageous ways of phrasing things, his use of language, might come into play in one way or another. I might just add, as we come towards a close, there are many excellent books written these days on Eckhart. Certainly one of the better introductions would be one by Richard Woods, Eckhart's Way. One with a great amount of profundity to it is the work done by Bernard McGinn. These would be places in which someone could begin, but there are many others as well, because as I say, Eckhart today is being recognized more and more, again in the context of a period in our history where there's an interest in a flowering of mysticism, recognized as indeed the Meister he always was. Conference 2, The Ground of the Soul. We're now moving from a kind of context in which we've placed Eckhart as German mysticism, Dominican life, the Meister, moving into actually the major themes in his preaching, let's say, particularly in his preaching. And in order to appreciate any of what he has to say, what we're talking about now, the notion of the soul, and especially the ground of the soul, becomes extremely important. Let me also say that once again, we want to entrust our reflections to the Lord as we gather, because what Eckhart has to teach us is not always easy to comprehend, at least not with the kind of analytical, discursive, scholastic mind, where we might want something exhibiting more precision in his thought. But we have to keep in mind much of what we say here is based upon sermons in which he wasn't so preoccupied as he would have been in his Latin works with stating something with theological precision, and therefore sometimes even the nature of his language is more in order to create or induce that which he seeks someone to experience or understand, rather than in a sense making the mind work more to help the mind move into the heart and be grasped by what it is that God does in the soul and in the ground of the soul. Let me also say that most of what we do in these next conferences will be to take different texts from the German sermons and simply reflect upon them and ask the question, what might it have meant and what does it mean for us? In other words, our goal is not to have a kind of systematic or analytic presentation of the entirety of Eckhart's thought, but rather to delve more deeply, almost experientially as well, into those themes that seem to have been at the core of his own mystical life and experience. And so we'll ponder in different ways some texts from these German sermons. I might also say that today the only purpose in what we're talking about now is to have some appreciation, some awareness of what Eckhart means by this expression, the ground of the soul. So we'll maybe talk around it in different ways with different texts in which he highlights on different occasions when he's preaching what this meant for him, but our goal is simply to have some deeper awareness of what this is and to see it in relationship to our own lives as well. The German word again here would be der Grund, the ground, spelled differently in medieval German than in modern German. And in German, there's an interesting little play on words because the word for abyss in German would be Abgrund. That would be without a ground. And so in some ways, Eckhart is going to say that God's ground and my ground or our ground is the same ground. We'll come to that text in a moment. But in German, what we could convey more easily is how the Grund, the ground, is in the end groundless and becomes a kind of Abgrund or abyss. That as one enters into the ground of the soul, there is a depth that's there that in the end is just entering into a depth without borders or boundaries, one might say. Well, okay, what is this ground of the soul? Let me put it in my own words first, and then we'll come to different ways in which Eckhart talks about it. Basically, let us think of ourselves as entering into our interior side, that we all have an exteriority, the ways in which we are active in the world, present in the world, and even our senses are attuned to the outer world. But there's also an inner world within each of us that today perhaps we associate especially with psychology. That is the study of the psyche, the soul, the interior life. But much of modern psychology only goes to a certain level of depth. Perhaps what we think of as depth psychology and the psychology of Jung would be that which pushes us to the deepest possible level psychologically. Well, for Eckhart and in spiritual theology or spirituality in general, we're concerned especially with the interior life, entering deeply within ourselves, going inside, and going therefore more and more deeply into our soul. That word soul even today is a difficult word as to how someone might understand it, but it does carry with it positive connotations when we put it in the context of something like saying to someone, well, do you have real soul? Or we think of soul music or soul food or even chicken soup for the soul. In other words, the word carries with it a certain positive aspect as that deep side of ourselves, that interiority. Well, the deeper one goes within oneself, one eventually comes to the deepest depth, if you will. That is the core of the soul, or the soul of the soul, or in Eckhart's language, the ground of the soul. Most mystics, not understanding it in exactly the same way as Eckhart might, have their own ways of speaking. So that Catherine of Siena had the expression, the cell of self-knowledge, that interior cell of self-knowledge. Teresa of Avila, most noteworthy perhaps, spoke about the interior castle and the different dwelling places, the innermost dwelling place within the interior life, the interior castle. John of the Cross would simply speak about the human spirit, as did St. Paul, that the human spirit, in contrast maybe to the Holy Spirit, that human spirit is the most pneumatic, the most spiritual, the most refined, the deepest, the core. So that's what we're trying to get at, is as we look at ourselves from the viewpoint of our interior life, the deepest, the furthest, or the highest to which we can go, this is where we ought to be grounded in the ground of our soul. We hear today also the expression centering prayer, the notion of being centered. And so to be living out of that center, for Eckhart it would be living out of that ground, the ground of the soul. And so he has a wide variety of expressions that he uses when he talks about this. Not always obviously in the same sermon, but sometimes they pile up within one sermon as well. Let me just read from one of his sermons, and you'll notice some of the different expressions that he uses. He says, "But let us take the words," and a sermon is always going to be based upon some text from Scripture, even though he might take it in whatever direction he chooses. "Take the words, in the midst of silence, there was spoken within me a secret word." So we have the sense of, in the midst of silence, within me, a secret word. "But, sir, where is the silence and the place where this word is spoken?" As I said just now, he speaks, it is in the purest thing. So we're trying to get a handle on where in the soul, within us, God's most profoundly at work. It's in the purest thing that the soul is capable of, in the noblest part, the purest, the noblest, the ground. Indeed, in the very essence of the soul's most secret part. You can almost see here the importance of his use of language. And here, in a way, brilliantly, one might say, as far as preaching is concerned, piling up different images on top of the one or another in order to draw us more deeply into the awareness of what this most secret, most noble, most pure aspect. There is the silent middle. It's an interesting expression that he also uses for the ground of the soul. The silent middle, for no creature ever entered there or any image. We have to come back and say more about that. In other words, in this deep part of the soul, there, in the silence of it, in the stillness, one moves beyond images and beyond words. He also says, in that sense, that none can touch the ground of the soul but God alone. In other words, it's really in the ground of the soul where God and I become one. It's in the ground of the soul where I'm more God, or let's say now more in God than I am in the world. In other words, I've moved apart from what we might want to call at this point distractions. We'll come in a later conference to talk about what involvement in the world then might mean. But our senses move us outward, create images, whether those be felt, whether they be simply sights, sounds, touch. But that's all connected with the outer world. We're now being drawn into the inner world, which in terms of the higher powers of the soul, for Eckhart, which would be like memory, understanding, or intellect, will or freedom, those higher, but even going more and more deeply beyond the kind of work that the intellect most ordinarily does, one enters into this noble part beyond all of this, where images really can't go themselves, and it's there that one finds God. The text from which I just read we'll come back to in a different way in the next conference, because it's interesting that it was a preaching that he did on Christmas Day. And on Christmas Day, because it's in the ground of the soul that the birth of the Word takes place, and it's that birth of the Word that's another tremendous theme in Eckhart's thought, and of course appropriate to reflect upon it on Christmas Day. In another sermon, he speaks and he says, "This is what the text I have given you is concerned with. God sent his only begotten Son into the world." Now we're familiar with that from Scripture's Gospel of John especially. God sent his only begotten Son into the world. You should not take this to mean the external world. Well, obviously in the Gospel of John, to a great degree, it does mean the external world, that the incarnation, God sent his only begotten Son. But Eckhart's interpreting it a little differently. Don't take this to mean the external world, as when he ate and drank with us, but rather understand this as the inner world. God sent his only begotten Son into the inner world. As surely as the Father, in his simple nature, bears the Son naturally. Now we're getting to some maybe more difficult concepts and also more risky thoughts, but if we grasp them properly, we'll see how traditional they really are. As surely as the Father, in his simple nature, in his simplicity, in his oneness, bears the Son naturally, that is, within the Trinity. The Son is the eternally only begotten Son of the Father. Just as surely he bears him in the inmost recesses of the Spirit in this inner world. So just as God begets the Son, say within the triune life, and just as sure as that Son is born in the world, so that Son is also, and that's the theme of our next conference, is born within our own interior life. And here then is that, I think, great quote where he says, here, that is there in that noblest part, that innermost part, God's ground is my ground and my ground is God's ground. In other words, when one enters there, is there any way to distinguish God from myself, from my deepest, innermost core? There, God's ground and my ground are the same ground. Indeed, if I am grounded in God, indeed in the depth of my soul, in the end, my ground is God. My soul, I am grounded in God. And God's ground and my ground are the same ground. In some ways, struggling with the notion, of course, that what? God and I are one. Now, to put this in as clear and orthodox a way as possible, Eckhart isn't denying that there's a difference between God and us. No, clearly, theologically, ontologically, if you will, there is a difference, and we'll come back to that several times in the course of these conferences. But experientially, if you will, phenomenologically, that the experience can be that God and I are one in the ground. In other words, in the ground of the soul, there, wherever that is, and in some ways there is, Eckhart will say, no there, because we're not talking in spatial terms really anymore, but in the ground of the soul, there God is. If we continue to another text from another sermon along a similar line, he will say there, that is, in the ground of the soul, just as God breaks through into me, So I break through in turn into him. Now we could spend a long time reflecting upon this expression of breakthrough. Besides the ground of the soul, in Eckhart you have this notion of der Durchbruch, the breakthrough. And how does he understand it? Different interpretations that people will bring to it. But clearly it's in the ground of the soul where God breaks through into our lives. It's in the ground where God breaks through to us. And it's in the ground where God is breaking through to us that we then break through into God. It's a kind of twofold breakthrough, if you will. God breaks through to us, and that means in some ways especially into our awareness, into our consciousness, and at the same time then, it's our breaking through into God. So we could come back to the text we just referred to, where God's ground and my ground, in a sense where I can say, as Eckhart will say, again boldly in one of his sermons, that I too am the Son of God. I too am the Son of God. In another place he will say, God is nowhere so truly as in the soul. In the angels, if you will, but he's not going there or talking about that, but rather God is nowhere so truly as in the inmost soul. Notice again the expressions, the inmost soul, the summit of the soul. When I say the inmost, I mean the highest. This is again worth pondering for a moment because of these two words here, inmost. Well, which is it, Eckhart? Is it the innermost, the deepest, the core, the depth, or is it the highest? And what is the difference between the deepest and the highest? For Eckhart, there's no difference, that the deepest part of us is the most noble, the highest part of it. I can recall once a marvelous contemporary writer on much mysticism, Dennis Turner, in reflecting on St. Augustine. And with Augustine, you have the notion of the confessions. And there, for the first time, almost in the history of Christian autobiographies, someone really reflecting more introspectively on his own life, and he goes inward. Augustine goes inward. But what he finds also inward is that which is above. And so, as Dennis Turner will put it, in a sense, the above is within. In other words, the deeper we go within, the more we find ourselves beyond ourselves. It's as if the depth is beyond us in some way or another. So that's the same thing in a way Eckhart is getting at. The innermost, the highest, he'll talk about it as the apex of the soul, the spark of the soul, the spark of the divine in the soul. It is really connected with the intellect, which is the noblest and the highest and the innermost aspect of us, that kind of thing. In another place, pointing again about the importance of this interiority, he will say, a master says, when he uses that expression, a master, he's very humbly in a way talking about himself. He doesn't say I say, but someone says, a master says, the soul in her own nature has as little to do with what's in the world as the eye has to do with song or the ear with color. In other words, just as the eye is not concerned with sound, so the soul by nature, Eckhart is suggesting, the soul by nature is not really concerned with the external world, although in fact, much of what the soul does through its senses or even through its interior life with intellect, memory, and will is concerned with the external world. But what the soul really, if you want to put it that way, is about. And so he says, accordingly, our natural philosophers say that the body is more in the soul than the soul in the body. It's an interesting expression because often what we might tend to say today is we think of, if we talk about ourselves in terms of a body and soul, we think of, well, the soul is in the body, my body has a soul, that kind of thing. But even in terms of some reflections today, in terms of neuroscience and those kinds of things, and in the materialistic world, we might think that the interior life is all connected with the brain, but it's much more that the soul uses the brain, we would have to say today, than that the brain is the source of all of our intellectual life. The brain is kind of an organ, just like the eye is an organ, but actually the body's in the soul. The soul is that deeper, that more essential, that core of who we are. And so if we stop for a second and just ask the question, do you have some appreciation of what we're talking about at all? We're talking about our innermost depth. And this leads us also then into what will come up again and again, what we could call Eckhart's mystical line as being apophatic. There's a strong tradition in Christian history of apophatic mysticism. That means, in the end, unknowing, knowing by not knowing. We even think of works influenced by Eckhart, one might say, and in the 14th century, the cloud of unknowing, that kind of thing. So in another text, Eckhart says, no one can know an angel's name. Interestingly, he says, Gabriel is no more called Gabriel than Conrad. In other words, no one knows an angel's name. And likewise, the soul too has no name. In other words, when we enter that realm of the ground of the soul, we're entering a realm of unknowability. There is the ground, but that ground is groundless. The Grund becomes an abyss, and it's there in the abyss that we find ourselves, and there is no name. Just as no one can find a true name for God, he proclaims, no one can find, and we'll come back to that as we talk more about God, that God too doesn't have a name. But then he says, what the soul loves, the soul becomes, grows to be like. If the soul loves earthly things, becomes earthly. But if we love God, do we then become God? Does the soul then become God? Another theme, very traditional, maybe not as common for us in the West, is that theme, especially in Eastern theology, of deification. That in some ways, God became man so that we might become God. But the ground, which Eckhart also describes as in the end groundless, which is the ground of God, and maybe the best text for us to just keep in mind is that God's ground and my ground are the same ground. That where everything happens really is in that innermost, the ground of the soul, where Eckhart uses all of these different expressions to try to lead us there. The spark, the depth, the innermost. Conference 3, the birth of the Word in the ground. Again, let us remember God and how we rely upon God for understanding the depths of what Eckhart is trying to communicate. And as we think of the birth of the Word, we might also call to mind our Blessed Mother, because we will be referring to the birth of the Word as well in the womb of the Virgin Mary. Just as in the last conference, I hope you were able to pick up some sense, a feel for, perhaps some understanding or appreciation of what Eckhart is getting at when he's talking about the ground of the soul. In some ways, it's not easy to conceptualize that groundless ground in which we are to be grounded. But on the other hand, it's really quite simple, as one especially maybe uses images like depth, that there is that innermost, that deepest, that most noble. So we've gone within to the deepest where we might go, which in the end where it becomes almost an abyss, a groundless abyss, but it's in that abysmal ground, we might say, that we're now asking the question, what's going on there? Because we said that that's where God and I are most intimately one. Well, what's going on there for Eckhart is what he calls the birth of the Word. Now, this theme of birth of the Word is not new in the history of Christian thought. There are others before who've spoken of it, but it's the kind of predominant emphasis that Eckhart gives to it that becomes distinctive. Just as in the previous conference, I said if we just want to have one primary focus for ourselves, it's to come to some appreciation or awareness of what it means when we talk about the ground, the soul, or being grounded in the ground. So in this conference, our kind of concern will just be, what does it mean for us to say that in that ground, that is in me, in my innermost, most noble, highest, whatever, that in that ground, God is, and God is being born. That what God is doing there in the ground of my soul is giving birth. That God is birthing there God's very own Son in the ground of my soul. The birth of the Word of God, the second person of the Trinity. That this is that God is in me giving birth. That's what we're going to try to appreciate. Now, maybe before we take some of the texts again from some of the sermons that we find with Eckhart and his own language and way of speaking about it, let me make reference to what has been called the threefold birth of the Word. It will just be helpful for us as a framework, which one finds really in some frame or another going back as far as St. Augustine. So again, it's not like, oh, this is utterly new, even so someone might be startled by it. It in its own way is a very traditional, the threefold birth. And it's something that one finds also then in the followers or disciples of Eckhart. For instance, someone like John Tauler also in his preaching will speak about that threefold birth. And the threefold birth is the birth of the Word in the Godhead, the birth of the Word in God. That is the non-temporal, eternal coming to be of the Son of God, the only begotten Son. So in a way, within the Trinity, within the triune life, God is being born. That is, the Word, the Son of God, is begotten. So there's the eternal birth before all time, in God, in God's triune life, in the Godhead, the eternal birth of the Word. But then, the Word is not only born eternally in God, with God, as the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, but the Word is also born in time. That is, in history. The incarnate Word, the eternal Word, becomes incarnate historically, born in the womb of Mary. The birth of the Word in Mary, physically in Mary, the birth of the Word historically in time, the incarnate Word. But then what Eckhart is getting at is a third birth, the birth of the Word, not only eternally in the Godhead, historically in time as incarnate, but also the birth of the Word in us, in the ground of the soul, that the Word is also being born today in me, in you, in us. And Eckhart will also make the point, as John Tauler will also, in asking the question of these, which is the most important? Tough question, maybe unanswerable, and perhaps not well phrased from one point of view, because not one is more important than the other. But what Eckhart will emphasize, as does Tauler, is that the birth of the Word in us has an importance and a significance that we can't dismiss. Because, I'll put it this way, of what value is it if the Word was born in the womb of Mary in time, if the Word isn't being born in us today. In other words, the whole purpose of the birth of the Word in time is so that the Word might continually be born in us. Well, let us let Eckhart speak for himself about this threefold birth and use some of the language that he uses. In, again, one place, keeping in mind this notion now of this most noble, innermost, most subtle, he asks the question, where in the soul? Where in the soul does God the Father speak his word? Well, you probably could almost immediately know the response to that question. From all that we said, it's going to be clearly in the ground of the soul. Where, in other words, does God beget the word? And he says, in the very purest, loftiest, subtlest part. That's where God is at work giving birth to the word. He continues in different ways, and he'll say, if anyone were to ask me, why do we pray? Why do we fast? Why do all the works that we do? Why are we even baptized? Or, most important, why did God become one of us? Why did God become man? He said, I would answer, in order that God may be born in the soul, and the soul born in God. Let's just stop with that sentence for a moment to kind of absorb it. Why pray? Why fast? Why be baptized? Why any of these things? So that, what's it all about? So that God might be born in us. That God might be born in the soul, and the soul born in God. If you come back to something we had said briefly in the previous conference about the breakthrough, that it's in the ground of the soul where God breaks through into us, and then we can break through into God. And so then God's ground and my ground are the same ground. He's getting a similar kind of thing here, that God may be born in the soul and the soul in God. Thus the eternal word is spoken inwardly, in the heart of the soul, in the inmost and purest. In other words, in the head of the soul, which is also then in the intellect. Therein the birth takes place. Now, we didn't emphasize that so much in the previous conference. When we talk about the ground of the soul, the highest part is also the intellect, intellectus in Latin, a word Eckhart would have used especially in his Latin and scholastic writings. In other words, it's in the intellect, and there we're not talking about, and the distinction is often made even by someone like Thomas Aquinas, between, say, the highest function of the intellect and the more discursive, rational, analytical. We're not talking about the rational, analytical, but in the highest thing that the intellect can perform is it can become aware. And so the birth of the word isn't just what God is doing in the soul, but in what God is doing there, it's in our becoming aware, conscious in a sense, of God's being there, and of my being in God, and God being in me. So, in another place he describes it this way. He says, we have to say concerning the eternal birth, which took place in time, the eternal birth, but then that birth which also takes place in time, and still happens daily in the innermost part of the soul, in her ground. In other words, where does the birth take place? In the ground. It's that interior birth that is the Father's business. In a way, again, keeping in mind that all of these texts come from some sermons, and there would be a biblical text. And even when Jesus says, I must be about my Father's business, what is his Father's business? When, in the finding of Jesus in the temple, he says that to his parents. Well, his Father's business is about giving birth. That whole notion of. And then Eckhart, in a very different sermon, will say, I say that if Mary, this is significant and challenging in some ways, I say that if Mary had not first borne God spiritually, he would never have been born of her physically. Well, ain't that something? In other words, even for Mary, Eckhart is going to say, which was the greater privilege? Mary's physical giving birth to the Word as the incarnate Word, or her giving birth to the Word in the ground of her soul, that is, the spiritual birth. Even for Mary, the greater is the birth of the Word in her soul. That's saying a lot, and it makes one pause, because it's that self-same birth that takes place in us. He continues, it is more worth to God to be born spiritually than it was to be physically born of Mary. I said recently in one place that when God created all creatures, if God had not previously begotten something that was uncreated, that bore within itself the images of all creatures, that is the spark that is so akin to God and contains all creatures within it. In other words, he's probing more deeply this notion here of the birth, and that already in God, before you and I ever born, before we become creatures, that in some ways we all have a pre-existence. Before we are born on earth, we are already there in some way in the mind of God. And so I said recently that when God created all creatures, if God had not previously begotten in an uncreated way the images of all creatures, in other words, we are already in God before we are created. Well, as Eckhart ponders, and as you and I ponder the full significance, you can see that over a period of time now, he's been preaching for a number of years, he's been reflecting and writing, he's taking this understanding of the birth deeper and deeper in terms of really some implications of it, that if you just took one of these quotes out of context, such as would have happened in a sense when he was charged with heretical thoughts, they are going to be misunderstood. But if you put them in the context that, yes, indeed, we are already born in God before we are ever born or created on earth. Let's pursue that further, because that's one of the more challenging aspects in Eckhart's thought. He says in another place, now observe, no one knows the Father except the Son. This here is a text really from the Gospel of Matthew. No one knows the Father except the Son. Well, if so, if we are to know God, and therein consists our happiness or bliss, if we are to know God, we must be with Christ, the only Son. So he's going to get at the notion that in some ways you and I, that we too are God's only begotten Son. Well, if you just read that as a sentence out of context, it would sound as if we're denying there's any difference between the Son of God and ourselves. Again, Eckhart's not saying that, but if God is to be born in us and we are to be reborn, let's say, in God, then indeed we too in some way must be with Christ, God's only begotten Son. There can be only one Son, and we are all, if you want, sons in the Son or sons and daughters in the Son. That's another way of putting it, but Eckhart puts it in the most bold way possible. He says, so if you would be blessed, you must be one son, not many sons. True, and this is where then he will come back to indicate his orthodox thinking. True, you remain clearly distinguished from God in your carnal birth. In other words, in your being created, in your birth on earth, you're clearly different from God. So I can't say, here I am, I'm God. No, I'm clearly distinguished through my carnal or human birth. But, he says, in the eternal birth, you must be one with God. Let's see if we can grapple with that. Perhaps we should just pass it by and kind of ignore it in one way or another. But in the eternal birth, here we have some of the influence of Platonic thought, You may or may not be so familiar with that, but Plato had the notion of like the forms or the ideas, the archetypes, if you will, of everything that exists on earth as a kind of primordial, non-spatial, in a way, existence separate from and apart from us. And when that gets incorporated into Christian thought, like with St. Augustine, it would be that all of those images or archetypes or models for who we all are, that all exists in the mind of God. And that probably makes sense to us, that what humanity is, what an apple is, these all exist in the mind of God before they exist as creatures. So likewise, Don Gergen exists in the mind of God before I was ever born. So in some ways, that eternal birth, that in the beginning, I am in the beginning with God, because there is already in God, and if God is eternal and simple, that then we are all there in God, in that eternal birth. And in that eternal birth, we can't make distinctions in God. God is simple. He's not a composite. So in God, we are one with God, and we are then God's son. Maybe let's put it this way from a different sermon of Eckhart. And so if you ask me, since I am an only son whom the Heavenly Father has eternally begotten, again, going back to my life before I was born in the mind of God as eternally begotten, whether I have eternally been that son of God, have I eternally been? My answer is yes and no. Again, if one were to have taken some of the texts of which Eckhart had been accused for false teaching and place them in the proper context, here clearly he's making a significant distinction. He says, my answer is yes and no, a way in which and a way in which no. Yes, a son in that the Father has eternally begotten me, but not a son by way of being unborn. In other words, there are two ways, if you wish, in which I am God's only son. I am, from the beginning, in God, in the Godhead, one with God, but I am not that eternal son by way of being born. That is, I'm not unborn in the same way that the eternal Son is unborn. Some of this may be a little difficult to grasp, but that's why, again, I say it's not best sometimes to approach Eckhart's thought too analytically, wanting a precise understanding, but just trying to get a feel and openness, an awareness, a mindfulness, we might say, of what God is doing in the soul. And in the ground of the soul, God is there, being born, and in that ground, I too am being born or reborn as God's son. In other words, it's in the ground of the soul that God and I are really becoming one. Here's a quote that I like that might be a little easier to grasp, but not one with which we might more easily be comfortable until we stay with it and let it sink in and we ponder it. But it does make sense. In another of his sermons, he says, if you were to cast a drop of water into the ocean, if you were to cast a drop into the ocean, the drop would become the ocean, and not the ocean, the drop. Thus it is with the soul. When she imbibes God, she's turned into God, so that the soul becomes divine, but God does not become the soul. Then the soul loses her name and her power, but not her will and her existence. Let's go back to that image. As I say, I think it's comprehensible, even if it might leave us uncomfortable for a while. If you were to cast a drop into the ocean, obviously that makes sense. The drop becomes a part of the ocean, becomes the ocean, indistinguishable from the ocean. But the ocean doesn't become the drop. It's still a drop in the ocean, even if one can't any longer separate that drop out from the rest of the ocean. So likewise with the soul. When the soul imbibes God, when the soul is grounded in God, when the soul is taken up in God, when God is born in the soul, God is bigger than the soul, and so that it's the soul that becomes one with God. It's not that God becomes the soul. In other words, there is no pantheism in what Eckhart is saying, if one's thought moved in that direction. Although we could use the contemporary word, which would not have been Eckhart's, panentheism, that everything is in God and God is in everything, which we already find in Paul, first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, where he says, in the end, God will be all in all. And so there's this effort, this struggle to talk about our oneness, if you will, our oneness with God. The soul in God, drop of water in the ocean. What happens in the ground of the soul is the same thing that happens when you pour the water into the ocean. That it's still that water that's in the ocean, but it's no longer distinguishable, separable from. And so likewise, when we find ourselves, if you want, drowned in God, or intoxicated with God, or filled with God, when we find ourselves in God, we can no longer say where God begins and I end, or I begin and God ends. In other words, but again, we're speaking experientially, not theologically or ontologically, because Eckhart has made that distinction, that there is no distinction that we can make in the Godhead between God and us, but due to our carnal birth, no, in that sense, I am not God, but once I enter into the ground of the soul, it's there that I become aware, mindful, conscious of who I am, that ultimately I am one with God. And therefore, in another place, he will say, maybe we'll come back because it's a great text, where he says that my isness and God's isness, just as my ground and God's ground, he says, you should wholly sink away from your you-ness and dissolve in his hisness. And your yours and his should become completely one. Mind that with him you understand his isness and his nameless nothingness. So we are simply lost in God. Conference 4, letting go, detachment. I don't know where you are with respect to what we've been saying. But let's kind of go back there into the mystery of our lives and the mystic that each of us is called to be, that each of us is, if we become mindful of who we are at our innermost, wherein, in that innermost ground, God is at work giving birth. The question now might be, how, practically speaking, might we either approach that awareness or not become an obstacle to its continually happening, which happens even when we're not conscious of it, but how can we not be an obstacle to our becoming more and more deeply aware? And here, again, in a very strong way, we have a significant theme in Eckhart's spirituality, the theme of what most commonly is spoken of as detachment. And we'll try to come to some appreciation of our role as becoming just, becoming detached. I prefer the word detachment. In other words, non-attachment. What we're talking about is letting go of our attachments. And in German, Again, we have two words with which we would need to wrestle. The one word, Gelassenheit, is the word most often translated as detachment, or let's say detachment. But another is the word Gelassenheit, which really means a letting go. And are these the same thing, or how are they related to each other? And again, different interpreters will attempt to clarify them differently. But in the end, perhaps some things in Eckhart's thought can't be fully clarified with the kind of analytical precision we might sometimes prefer, because in one occasion, in one sermon, on one day, in another year, etc., that kind of thing, he might be drawn more to one expression or another as trying to help us to appreciate what is happening as the word is being born in the ground of our soul, what's happening in some ways, and how can we facilitate, or let's say not get in the way of that. And that process is letting go and detaching, not becoming attached. It's a rather radical way of looking at the spiritual life, rather challenging, but keep in mind that the women especially, and then the wider friends of God, those who were taken with Eckhart's preaching or who longed for his spiritual teaching, wanted to be taken in a challenging way to a deeper level of the spiritual life. Here, in addition to the German sermons, we are fortunate to have, I referred in the first conference to some of the treatises that he also wrote, 4 of them in German. I'll just mention them here, but one of them is specifically on the theme we're talking about today. One was entitled The Counsels on Discernment, well worth reading. The Book of Divine Consolation, another, of course, well worth reading. Then one of the Noblemen, in which he really is talking there about the soul and the nobility of the soul. But finally, one on detachment. So we'll take a couple texts from the German sermons, but more of the text will come from that particular treatise on detachment. And so, another great quote, maybe it's just one that I love, or one that has captured many people, just as in the earlier conferences, there was that quote about God's ground and my ground are the same ground. And the more one just stays with that and ponders it and comes to a deeper awareness, yes, in my ground is grounded in God, and I can't differentiate experientially God's ground and my ground. There's that one ground in which we are one, or likewise in the last conference, the whole notion of when one drops a drop in the ocean, that Eckhart clearly has this sense of our unity, our oneness, the theme in Christian theology of deification, which is not so familiar to us in the West, but is clearly a very prominent theme throughout Christian tradition, going back to Augustine, to Athanasius, to Irenaeus, to many of the early theologians, fathers of the church. Anyway, here's another quote to challenge us that, again, if it isn't put in the whole context and ambiance of what Eckhart's trying to communicate, now he's preached to some of these nuns or some of these women or others on many occasions before. Anyway, in one of the sermons he says, a man who is thus established in God's will wants nothing but what is God's will and what is God. We're getting to the notion of detachment here. In other words, a person who really is establishing himself more and more, herself more and more into God, wills only what God wills. I might have my own will, and there might be aspects of my will that I will, but in the end, the prayer will be the prayer of Christ in Gethsemane, not what I will, but what you will. But then he goes on and says, and this is the text, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. Let's just take a moment with that. It may not come as a shock or a surprise, given what we've already said about God's ground and my ground. But if you just heard it, never heard anything else about Eckhart, just read the quote, you'd either love it or you'd be mistrustful. The eye with which I see God and the eye with which God sees me is the same eye. My eye and God's eye are one eye. Well, how can that be? Especially if we were to transfer it to, say, our human world and say the eye with which I see you and the eye with which you see me is the same eye. Well, clearly makes no sense, we might say. But the more we ponder it, what is the eye with which I see you? Is it this eye, this physical eye, this sense eye, or is it an inner eye? What is the eye with which I see you? Even in another context, at times I've spoken about it in terms of the Holy Spirit. If the eye with which I see you is the Holy Spirit, but here with Eckhart, let's just say it's that inner eye. If the eye with which I see you, if it's the eye of my soul with which I see you, and the eye of your soul with which you see me, that eye with which you see me, that interiority in the end, is what? The same eye. You and I are one also in that sense, but now Eckhart's text is really in reference to God. It's not saying something really different from God's ground is my ground. The eye with which the inner eye, the understanding, the mind, the mindfulness with which I grasp God, with which I see God or come to know God, is the same ground, is the same awareness in a sense with which God sees me. So that in that union, in that birth of the Word, in the ground of the soul, where we become one, there's a mutual seeing, a mutual knowing, a mutual loving, and therefore there's one love. God's love for me and my love for God. One knowing, God knowing me, and in God's knowing me, my knowing God, and my knowing God's knowing me. This is what's going on in the soul. Well, in another text, we want to get to this notion of detachment, because that's what really gives us this. In the end, we don't want to say, and yet we do want to say our identity, let's say our oneness with God. In reflecting on the text, blessed are the poor in spirit. He says, now there are two kinds of poverty. One is external poverty. You know, external poverty, really we could say in the sense of economic poverty that we experience in the world. But here he's talking about an external poverty in the sense of those who practice poverty voluntarily. Therefore, it would be religious, but also the Beguines and others who practiced a very simple mode of life. In other words, those who practice it voluntarily for the love of Christ. But he says there's another kind of poverty, always, of course. There's always, besides the external, the internal, there's another kind of poverty, an interior poverty. And that's what blessed are the poor in spirit. Well, what is this interior poverty? It's getting at the letting go. He says a poor man, a poor person, is one who wants nothing. Well, is that a possibility in this life? Eckhart would suggest yes. In other words, not to want anything other than God. And Eckhart will even say in some ways, to want God is to have a want that we ought not have. In other words, a poor person is one who wants nothing, knows nothing, and has nothing. Getting at the whole notion in some ways that who are we? We are nothing. That might sound outrageous to Catherine of Siena, of course, later than Eckhart, and not a part of the whole Rhineland mystical movement. Clearly, she's an Italian woman. Once had the Lord say to her, I am the one who is, and you are the one who is not. I am the one who is, you are the one who is not. There is a certain nothingness about who we are, which basically means we are nothing apart from God. In other words, our real being is borrowed from God and is in God. Anyway, he goes on in this same sermon. There are some who do not properly understand the meaning of this. These are the people who cling with attachment. So now we're getting at the theme. Who cling with attachment to penances and outward practices. It's interesting. We often, when we think of attachment, we think of, the possessions of the earth, a new home or car that we might want. In Eckhart's day, been different things, even the desire for knowledge or those kinds. But he says that even people who cling in some ways are attached to certain ascetical practices, certain penances, outward practices. These are people called holy from their outward appearances, but inwardly they are asses, for they're ignorant of the real nature of divine truth. Now, maybe that's not what we most need to hear. Maybe those aren't the things we're attached to, certain kinds of penitential practices. But he's preaching to people who are struggling to live a simple life. He's preaching to cloistered nuns. He's preaching to lay men and women in the world striving to live a deep spiritual life. And there's the danger there that one can get caught up in. The more ascetical my life, the more ascetical my practice, the closer I am to God. And he's pointing out that this is also a form of attachment, that one has to even let go of that. All you can have is the will to do the will of God. In another place, he writes, and now we're going to move to a couple texts actually from that treatise on detachment, in which he says, and here whether we would want to say it in the same way or not isn't so important, but that we just see the importance of this letting go, this Gelassenheit, this detachment kind of a thing, in which he says, which is the greatest and best virtue? What would you say without thinking for a moment? Which is the greatest and the best virtue? He says, with which we can by grace become that which God is by nature. Another whole theme is a part of the notion of deification, that we can become by grace what God is by nature. And he goes on to say, I find no other virtue better than pure detachment. I find no other virtue more important, better, more noble than pure detachment, non-attachment. And he'll say in the same treatise, I praise detachment more than love. I praise detachment above all humility. Now, this is where we should stop and say we don't have to agree with what he's saying, while at the same time we can agree with what he's saying. In other words, there is a certain paradoxical element in our attempt ever to come to grips with some of the things that Eckhart says. Clearly, in the spiritual tradition, in the writing of the saints, almost among all of them, there's no virtue more foundational, let's say, than that of humility. For Catherine of Siena, it's the soil in which everything else takes place. That's that core virtue, if you will. True self-knowledge. For someone like Bernard of Clairvaux, he spoke about 12 different degrees of humility. St. Benedict has that as well. So Bernard writing in that Benedictine tradition, you could say. And likewise, Thomas Aquinas will refer to that as well, that different degrees of humility. But humility is, in the end, the base upon which everything else. Or we could put it in another way, which would be true in theology. What is that at which all of Christian life aims? It's caritas, or charity, or love of God and love of neighbor. That's already there in the teachings of Jesus, love of God and love of neighbor. In St. Paul, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. So these two, caritas and humilitas, or charity and humility, depending on how one might be speaking at a particular moment, one or the other, or both, are what the Christian life essentially is all about. So when Eckhart comes here and says, I praise detachment more than humility, I think what we should say here, and it'll help us whenever we read Eckhart, that sometimes he might say something specifically in a somewhat outlandish way in order to bring home a point. So he's not writing as in his Latin works and treatises and commentaries on scripture and those kinds of things with the same kind of analytical precision that, a scholastic theologian might, at which he was quite capable, that kind of thing. But he's trying to bring home a point that the purpose of preaching is different from the purpose of teaching or of doing theology, that kind of thing. And so the point he wants to make is to get these people to whom he's preaching to be aware that they can err in the direction of becoming too attached to their way, their method, that this is what's going to lead me to union with God. And he wants to get that out of the way and have them let go of that. So it's almost hyperbole, if you will, or exaggeration when he says, I praise detachment above all humility. Well, whether that's true or not, it makes us stop and think, to what am I attached? And in that sense, letting go, Gelassenheit, means, yes, letting go of things in the world. That's where most of us would have as a starting point. Even letting go of our possessiveness of others in some ways. That's what the life of chastity, is about. Non-possessiveness with relationships, with human relationships. Doesn't mean we don't love and care about people, but we don't possess them. They aren't ours, in other words. And in the end, even letting go of our own self-identities and understanding. I can think of, well, who is Don Gergen? Well, he's an American, or he's a Dominican, or he's Catholic, or he's from Iowa, or whatever. In the end, the more attached we are even to those identities, it's like, well, the drop of water in the ocean. It's the drop that's there, but the boundaries are expanded. It's no longer like, well, I can identify. So there's a lot for us to let go of, but in the end, what's most difficult is probably letting go of some of our spiritual practices, things to which we're spiritually attached, even letting go in some ways of our will, of our fondest ideas, our thoughts, our knowing, those kinds of things. So anyway, why does he say this about humility? He says, there cannot be perfect detachment without perfect humility. But one could, in theory, have humility, he will say, without detachment. Again, it might just depend on how you interpret those words, but basically trying to get at the core that we might grow in humility and self-awareness, in a proper self-understanding without complete detachment, but you can't become completely detached without humility. Perfect humility means letting go in some ways of my own self. It is now not I, but God who lives in me. So that detachment gets us more closely to an awareness of the nothingness that each of us is. That's, again, a strong statement, and in the end, but it come back to maybe the way Catherine of Siena put it. God says, I am the one who is, you're the one who is not. Eckhart in another place will speak about that as even our very being, it's on loan from God. I would not be apart from God, so that my being is a participation in God's being. I would not be who I am apart from God. And so it's detachment that gets us closer to the truth of things. But why would he say then that he would also praise detachment more than love or charity or caritas? That's an interesting one. And again, it's just worth pondering. It just, pushes us to take a look at our hierarchy of values in some way or another. He says the best thing about love is that it compels me to love God. The best thing about caritas is it makes me love God, whether it necessitates, it's certainly a freely chosen love for God, but nevertheless, what happens there is that I'm drawn into a love of God. But when it comes to detachment, what you have is not just that I'm kind of drawn to love God, but that in attachment, God loves me. God is compelled to love me, that in some ways, when I love God, it's like taking God as good. In another place he'll say, and we'll come to that quote probably in the next conference, it's like taking God with a cloak on in some ways or another. In other words, who couldn't love God, the more lovable you find God to be. But in detachment, you're just letting things be and letting God be God and letting God love me. So he says also in that treatise on detachment, therefore, whoever longs to attain to perfect detachment, let him struggle for perfect humility. In other words, in the end, are these not, for Eckhart, practically speaking, the same thing? Let him struggle for perfect humility, and so he will come close to divinity. So whether it's humility or whether it's detachment, what is there is going through a process of detachment, letting go of those things to which we cling, after which we grasp. Texts like this will also be a basis for many people bringing Eckhart into conversation with, like, say, Buddhist and Hindu thought, because some of these emphases you would certainly find in the Buddha as well when you think of their attachment as being the source of suffering. We in our conferences won't reflect on the ways in which there might be some parallels between how Asian mystics and from India and in Buddhism, etc., might look at the spiritual life and how Eckhart did, because Eckhart's is certainly extremely Christocentric in its own way and theistic, which you might not always find in these, but nevertheless there are those bases upon which one might take a look at them in that similar way. So another expression that we maybe should just refer to as we come to a close is that Eckhart's path, if you will, to the spiritual life, Eckhart's way, is sometimes called the wayless way, the wayless way, the way without a way, the way that is no way. In other words, he will say in another place, and it's just like with our attachment to ascetical practices or to a particular form of prayer, all of those things which can be good along the way, but it's possible for us to become attached to the way. And then we lose the way because we're more attached to the way than we are to just letting God be God in us, our kind of naked nothingness before God. Conference 5. Contemplata aliis tradere. Martha and Mary. Let us take a second to look back at where we've been. Eckhart is unfolding for us in some way the life of the soul as being that seat within which we find our purpose in life, our destiny as union with God. And in the ground of the soul, the core of the soul, the subtlest, noblest, highest, innermost facet of the soul, not that the soul has parts, but that's our way of speaking, trying to get to an understanding, appreciation of the depth within us, in our interiority. In the ground of the soul, there God is giving birth to God's Word, to the Word of God, the Son of God, giving birth there, just as God gives birth within his own triune life, the eternal birth, and gave birth in history, the incarnate Word. So likewise, in the depth of ourselves, in the ground of our soul, God is being born and giving birth. We then talked more about how this birth might happen, and at the core of Eckhart's appreciation, understanding of the spiritual life is this virtue of detachment or non-attachment or detachment or letting go. letting go of all that might get in the way. Letting go even eventually to the point of letting go of our images of God, our concepts of God, all those things which perhaps along the way somewhere might have been stepping stones toward God. In the process of entering more deeply into the ground of the soul, it's letting go of all of that which attaches us in some way to the exterior world, which includes not only the exterior world, not only what our senses sense as being oriented outward, but also even the images that we might have and the knowledge that our intellect might come to understand, but also what our will wills, letting go of, being detached from, which means in the end even being non-attached to our favorite spiritual practices, as wholesome as they might be, as helpful as they may have been, but our attachment to them can get in the way. And so even letting go then of all images, concepts, even words that might, in our imagination, make us think that we can describe or name God. Well, as we approach that whole process of letting go and detaching, we are entering into what really Eckhart would understand by the contemplative dimension of life. And here there's a rather novel way, innovative way, original way, in which he speaks to us about how he understands the relationship classically between Martha and Mary. But before I give you his interpretation, to say that again, if we place him in the context of his Dominican life, one of the mottos of the Dominican order from early centuries has been that expression, contemplare et contemplata aliis tradere. In other words, to contemplate and tradere, to hand on to others the fruits, the effects, the benefits of that which was contemplated. In other words, we find in this motto the kind of mixture, the twofold dimension that Dominican life, with St. Dominic and after him, attempted to outline, namely that we are called to be both contemplative, in Eckhart's terms, let's say deeply grounded in our ground, both contemplative and active. In other words, a Dominican is not someone ordinarily who is withdrawn from the world in a monastic way, but rather lives deeply contemplatively in the world. But we are called to be contemplatives, but active contemplatives, to contemplate, to be grounded in one's ground, and yet out of that groundedness to be of service, whether in preaching, teaching, corporal works of mercy, in whatever way, to hand on to others, so that contemplation isn't for oneself. It isn't about oneself. It's not simply living in the end interiorly enclosed within oneself, but out of that it is to bear fruit for others. And so then we enter into the question about, well, how would we put together what has become so symbolic throughout Christian history in the story in the Gospel of Luke about Martha and Mary, where frequently for us, most often for us, Mary is interpreted as the model of the contemplative life, Martha the model of the active life, and we tend to have seen Mary as having chosen the better part and therefore the superiority, we could say, of the contemplative life to the active life. Keeping in mind something that we had said in the previous conference about letting go of our attachments, even to our favorite forms of prayer in one way or another, realizing that in one of his German sermons, Eckhart himself said that prayer is nothing else but our uniformity with God's will. In other words, willing what God wills, and therefore even letting go of being unattached to our own willfulness. In one way, this is perhaps almost the last stage or the most challenging aspect of the spiritual journey of detachment and letting go of our own wills. And so if we're to think a little about prayer, because that's such a manifestation or avenue with respect to the contemplative dimension of our lives, let me just say that by way of some kind of spiritual advice, if you will, that it's not as if there is one way, this is the way, this is the best way to pray. What's important is to pray as you pray best. Or rather, let us say, to pray as God chooses for you to pray as God prays within you. In other words, our prayer in the end is to be what Eckhart says, a kind of union with the will of God. To always realize then that the contemplative side of prayer or contemplative prayer is really not something that we will, not something that we do, but rather that contemplation itself is a grace. It points to what God is doing within us. And what is God doing within us other than giving birth to His Word? However, if we are to enter into the ground of our soul, if we are to become more cognizant or mindful of the birth of the Word there, if we are to allow our prayer to really be a form, a shaping of detachment, of letting go, there are certain words that we might use to describe either prayer, contemplative prayer, or what's going on. And a couple of these words would be that prayer of that sort is, first of all, silent. In other words, the important role of silence. And in a number of his sermons, Eckhart will talk about that interior silence. Silence, interiority. So that in some ways, prayer is a silent, interior, and wordless, also imageless. We suggested that when we said the deeper we go, it's letting go of all of those things that attach us to the outside, and therefore letting go of images and eventually even words as capable of being the access to the ground. And so that contemplative prayer is really a silent, interior, wordless awareness or mindfulness of God in me, and my being in God, where God leaves off and I begin is a distinction that cannot be made, although we know that it is real and does exist. But rather, again, if we go back to a couple of our earlier statements about the drop of water in the ocean, or God's ground and my ground, or the eye with which I see God and the eye with which God sees me, that in the end, there is only the one, oneness, unity, another expression of Eckhart's, God's isness, and my isness really is God's isness, and my nothingness, because my isness, my being, comes from God. Well then, with all of that kind of being said, what would we say about the relationship between this grounded contemplative facet of our spiritual lives and the active outpouring of that into the world, into our lives of service or hospitality or ministry or whatever it might be? Certainly, Eckhart, as a profound Meister, as a profound contemplative, as a mystic par excellence, drawn deeply interiorly, lived his life in the world, whether as a professor, University of Paris, as a prior or provincial. He lived an incredibly active life, teaching, writing, preaching. And so it's quite clear that although he talks about letting go of all this connectedness to the exterior, he's very deeply involved in the exterior world in the sense of being there in service as a teacher, as a preacher, as a pastoral administrator, however one might want to put it. How do these two come together? Well, in fact, Eckhart gives us a couple, I think, quite profound images for us to come to an awareness of the balance that needs to take shape in each of us between the Martha in us, if you will, and the Mary in us. And so he gives us an interpretation of the Martha and Mary story in which actually Martha emerges as the more mature. Now, for those grounded in the history of Christian spirituality, this would come as a surprise, because for centuries and even into the 14th century, even with something like the cloud of unknowing, what emerges is what was traditional ever since the emergence of monasticism, that Mary had chosen the better part, the superiority, not the inappropriateness in any way of the active life. Most are all called to the active life, but there is something superior to the monastic way of being contemplative, we might put it. Well, for Eckhart, that's not the real gist or meaning of that story in the Gospel of Luke. And we would have to say even today, it's not what Luke would have understood, because Luke in the Gospel isn't struggling with the monastic vocation. That emerges really in the 3rd, 4th century, and that's when you begin to get that interpretation of the Martha Mary story. But for Luke, it is a story of discipleship. Well, how does Eckhart approach it? Basically, he's saying that when Martha says to Jesus, "Jesus, tell Mary to get up and help with the hospitality," it's not as if Martha is unconcerned for Mary. It's not as if she's upset with Mary. Rather, it's out of her deep affection for her sister that she's concerned about Mary, that Mary could get stuck in this contemplative modality of sitting at the feet of Jesus without being aware that her contemplating, her contemplating, her praying, her being at the foot of Jesus needs to bear fruit. In the trottering, in the handing on, it has to bear fruit. And so Martha, out of concern and affection, says to Jesus, encourage Mary to get up and help with the hospitality, because she needs to now know that that centeredness and groundedness needs to blossom forth and flow forth and pour forth into good works, if you will. And when Jesus says to Martha, 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 you're too worried about these things, don't be anxious about it. What Mary is doing, Mary needs to do. Because if she got up from her sitting now, she would lose her groundedness. Because she's not as mature as you, Martha, whereby you can be there in the world and you can be of service and still be grounded. In other words, what we need to do is to be of service out of our grounded interiority. It's living out of that deep, contemplative, interior, most noble space that we give to others. And if Mary got up now from her sitting, she would lose that, and she would be actually a Martha, if you want, in the activistic or hyperactive kind of way. And so Martha is really the one who models for us what it means to be in the world and grounded at the same time. Now, let me give a couple other images that Eckhart will provide for us to try to come to grips with this. The first, which he doesn't say as explicitly as Catherine of Siena does, but he does in terms of his reference to the whole notion of giving birth. And basically, take this image, I'll put it this way, in my own way for now. Take for an image or an example of a woman who is pregnant. What is the whole hope or purpose of that pregnancy? The whole rationale for becoming pregnant, the whole desired outcome is that one gives birth. One becomes pregnant in order that one might give birth. one can't give birth without becoming pregnant. And one becomes pregnant in order to give birth. That is one's hope, lest it be a miscarriage in that way. And so that image of the pregnant woman helps us to see which is more important, the contemplative or the active, the contemplare, the contemplation, or the tradere, the handing on. Which is more important? You can't ask the question. Which is more important, becoming pregnant or giving birth? That image is marvelous because it helps us to see that this is all one thing. They're facets of one process, that one has to become pregnant in order to give birth. And if one becomes pregnant, it's all about giving birth. And therefore, in that image of birthing, we see the integration of the contemplative facet and the active facet of our spiritual lives. So even though Eckhart spoke so much about our interiority, there was never a hesitancy on his part to see that bearing fruit in terms of our life in the world, and for him in terms of, therefore, all his pastoral, administrative, preaching, teaching, whatever it might have been. Another image he uses, which is in one of his sermons, very fascinating, he talks about and uses the image of a virgin wife. Now, keep those two words, a virgin. It's important for each of us to be a virgin and each of us to be a wife. Each of us. Let me read the actual text in the homily or sermon in which he makes reference to that, which is not the same one in which he really talks about Martha and Mary. He says, our Lord Jesus Christ went into a citadel and was received by a virgin who was a wife. Virgin is as much as to say a person who is void of alien images, as empty as he was when he didn't exist. If a man were to be ever virginal, he would bear no fruit. Let's stop there now. In other words, to be a virgin, the way he's using the expression here, to be a virgin is to be pure, untouched in some ways, a person who's void, empty of all images that get in the way. Again, it's this notion of letting go of images, words, names for God, letting go of, it's that detaching process. In other words, if a person is to be a virgin, it simply means, it's not talking here in sexual terms, it's simply to be one who is empty, pure, naked before God in that sense. So it's important that each of us be grounded, which is another way of saying each of us to be a virgin or virginal. But then he goes on and says, if a person were to be forever virginal, that person would bear no fruit. So that it's important to be a virgin, but it's important to also be something more other than a virgin, because otherwise there would be no handing on the fruits of one's contemplative life. If he is to be fruitful, that is to bear fruit, he must needs be a wife. So, my soul needs to be both a virgin and a wife. He says, wife is the noblest title one can bestow on the soul, nobler than virgin. Now, this is perhaps surprising, but very significant, because in all that we've said thus far, the ground of the soul, the nobility of the soul, God giving birth to the Word in the soul, breaking through to God in the ground of the soul, God breaking through to us, my being God's only begotten Son in the birth of the Word in the soul, all of those kinds of things taking place at the deepest, noblest, most subtle level of interiority within each of us. In the end, all of that virginal stuff isn't as noble as, in a way, bearing fruit. In other words, we could say, of what value is it if a person becomes pregnant but doesn't give birth? Wife is the noblest title. For God to be fruitful in us is better, for only the fruitfulness of the gift is the thanks rendered for that gift. And so, just as humility, just as detachment, so likewise gratitude as almost another side of the coin of humility, you could say, that in gratitude for what God is doing in us, we are to be manifesting that gratitude by our fruitfulness in the world. So each of us is to be both virgin and wife. Each of us is to become pregnant and give birth. Each of us is to be both Martha and Mary, and one comes to spiritual maturity only when one really is Martha, giving birth in the world as a wife. But one can't be that wife in the world without first being a virgin. One can't give birth without having become pregnant. One can't be a Martha, in Eckhart's sense, without first having been a Mary, having sat at the feet of Jesus. I'm not going to read here some of the actual texts from that sermon in which he gives his understanding, his interpretation of the Martha Mary story, but it is worth reading of all of his sermons, one that would be very much beneficial for each of us. Another expression that we find in Eckhart is really two Latin words, bullitio and ebullitio, or boiling and boiling over. We'll come back to these in our next conference as we talk about God, because that's where Eckhart really applies them. But again, it can help us here in some ways to have an understanding of this contemplative way, the wayless way, that's really not a way, lest we get attached to a way, and letting go of all attachments and therefore all ways. And even in that sense, even when speaking about Martha and Mary, this isn't outlining a way, but rather an awareness, a way of seeing in that sense. But also those two words, boiling and boiling over, we could use here as another image that might be of help to us, in the sense that water, let's say, doesn't boil over unless it first boils. It has to boil, and if you let it boil long enough, it will boil over. Well, for Eckhart, these actually refer to the triune life, which is a kind of dynamic interaction of the boiling within the Godhead of the three persons, and that it boils over, that interactive love, into creation. And so the ebullitio, the boiling over, is creation. But we can bring it here and also see that the boiling is the becoming pregnant, that entering into the ground of the soul is where we let God boil up within us in the birth of the Word, but then it has to boil over also in terms of our service to others, handing on the fruits of contemplation. Conference 6, Eckhart's Godless God. We come to our final conference, and it's difficult for me to know whether I should try to keep this simple so that we gather together our insights, because what we most want is for what Eckhart has been teaching us to be of benefit to us personally. Not simply to know with our intellects a lot about Eckhart, but somehow to have been transformed through the wisdom that he imparts. Or on the other hand, not just keeping it simple, but challenging us even further, because as we enter into the mystery of the Godhead, clearly we are in over our heads, or we should say deep in our ground. And so let us try to do both, to keep it as clear as we can, while at the same time treading some fairly deep water. What we're speaking about now is really, from Eckhart's point of view, something about which we ought not speak. From one point of view, although clearly it's something about which he spoke frequently. There is one text from Eckhart's sermons in which he says, and it parallels something that really Augustine in another way had said centuries before, but Eckhart says, the more we speak about God as ineffable, the less we say about God as ineffable. I don't know if that makes sense. Let me repeat it. In other words, the notion of the ineffability of God, the unfathomability of God, the mystery of God, the transcendence, the incomprehensibility of God. Ultimately, this is very strong for Eckhart, and in the kind of Platonic, Neoplatonic traditions of spirituality, and certainly in the whole apophatic, I used that word earlier once, traditions in spirituality, where even Aquinas would say, we know God best when we know him as one we can't know. In other words, the unknowability of God is what we're struggling with in one way or another. And therefore, the more we speak about God as ineffable, the less we really say about God as ineffable. Because when we're talking about his ineffability, we're still talking about him as if somehow we might comprehend him by emphasizing this particular aspect, not so much of God, but of our incapacity, really to grasp the fullness, the whatness of who God is. So that's kind of where we're headed, into the depth, the world, the abyss, the Abgrund, you could say, of mystery. So, Eckhart says, God is neither this nor that. We probably would agree with that, although often our language would almost communicate as if we know who or what God is, and God is this and not that. God is infinite, God is perfect, those kinds of words. But Eckhart says God is neither this nor that. And one master says, namely Eckhart himself, whoever thinks he has known God, if he has known anything, it was not God he knew. Let's ponder that. Many of Eckhart's statements, sometimes they can be hyperbolic, sometimes they can just be boldly, courageously, maybe even imprecisely said to get us in a way to stand back, to think, to go more deeply into something. And in a sense, we have that here, basically saying whoever thinks that he has known God, it's not God he knows. Because if you really knew God, you would know God, as Thomas Aquinas has said, as one unknown, as one unknowable. Ultimately, doesn't mean we don't have language with which we can speak of God, but nevertheless, in another place he will say, in a different sermon, thus the unplumbed depth of God has no name. For all names the soul gives to God are obtained from her understanding. But God is supra-essential, supra-rational, beyond comprehension as far as natural understanding is concerned. I do not speak of understanding through grace, that's a different thing, because by grace a person might be so transported as to understand as St. Paul did. Let me come back to that. For he was caught up in the third heaven, etc., etc. But nevertheless, in the end, for us, God remains unknown and has no name. I don't know if you find that exciting, challenging, about something you'd be doubtful, or really enriching. But it's a very strong tradition. The incomprehensibility, the transcendence, even if one were to go and read the very first chapter, if you will, of the Chinese spiritual work, the Tao Te Ching, which begins, the name that is the eternal name is not a name. It has no name. In other words, that in the end, we can't name God. And at this point, let's even ask the question, and we come back to it in a few minutes, can we even name God as God? Is God a name for God if God has no name? If God ultimately is nameless because of incomprehensible. In another place, Eckhart writes, and this pushes us even further, yet again I will say what I have never said before. Again, I will say what I've never said before. Must have said it in some way before, but he says, God and Godhead are as different as heaven and earth. Now, what's that all about? A distinction he's making from our vantage point, not from God's, that God and Godhead are as different as heaven and earth. God is loftier by many thousands of miles. God becomes and unbecomes. That's a phrase in Eckhart. Several times you find it that people have struggled with. And then at the end of this particular sermon, he will say something which I want to quote because it's helpful and also humorous. At the end of he says, "No one missed me," referring to a previous occasion, "for there God unbecomes." Unbecomes. Who has understood this sermon? Good luck to him. In other words, he's acknowledging himself that if you really think you understood what I just said, good luck. And so perhaps during this last conference, I could rely upon Eckhart's own wisdom and say the same thing. If you think you understood anything I said during these conferences, well, evidently God has been with you, and it's been a stroke of grace. But that's because Eckhart does continually take us where sometimes our minds aren't fully able to go. So, God and Godhead are as different as heaven and earth. People are uneasy, and understandably so, with this distinction. For Eckhart, the Godhead is the ultimate, the depth. It's entering into the ground that God is. And in the Godhead, there are no distinctions. And the suggestion is even there in the Godhead, you don't have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. You don't have the Trinity. Not that God isn't triune, and not that the Godhead isn't triune, but that one enters into the Godhead, one is entered beyond all distinction, all images, and in the Godhead, there is only the Godhead. But when one uses the word God, in a way, Eckhart suggests, and he wouldn't be the only one, that we can't name God God until we have creatures. That before creation, there is no God. In other words, the godless God, that is the Godhead, the ultimate silent space, non-space, because there is no there, no words that can go there, that the godless God isn't godless in the way we think of in terms of secularity or atheism or that kind of thing, but that before God became God, implying that God can't be named God until there are creatures who call God God, but that God doesn't depend upon us as creatures to name him or to know him. And so the God that is God, the Godhead that is God, before we come along or before we are created or before we approach in our efforts to understand, we're the ones that name God God. And so there is that which, however we might want to put it, God is. In God's godness, Gottheit, if you wish, in God's godness, godliness, what God is, before we make our efforts, in a sense, to comprehend, to approach, to even become one with. And therefore, that's where God unbecomes, where God just is. God becomes God when we come to be, because we are the ones who name God. Now, I'll just let that there. I think it's quite clear, but nevertheless, you might see this as, again, something that one couldn't comprehend without a stroke of good luck. But God is God apart from God's creation. And it's only creation that names God God. But that Godhead that's there, even apart from creation, in that silent depth, in that abyss, that's where God unbecomes what God has become by becoming the Lord of all creation. Well, let's give another text a chance in which he talks about where the soul is, the ground of the soul again, there is God. The soul is where God is. If God's in the soul and the soul's in God, then wherever God is, the soul is. Again, a kind of implication that one could see as verging on something unorthodox, unless it is, as it needs to be, put in a certain context, because the soul is where God is, and therefore where God is everywhere. Therefore, in some way, I am everywhere because I am in God. He says, all of this is the work of the persons. Now, here he's talking about the Trinity. No question he believes in the Trinity, the work of but the Godhead, when he talks about the Godhead, he's not talking in triune terms as such. He says, all this is the work of persons. Above this is being that does not work. In other words, getting into the Godhead again, where God is one, it's in that place where the soul grasps the complete depth of what God is, really, we could say, in the unknowingness. And that's another expression that Eckhart will actually use, the absolute unknowingness of God. Okay, so far so good. Let me pretend, anyway, that we've come to grasp something of the ungraspability of what we're trying to talk about. That as we enter into the ground of the soul, where God is at work giving birth, and as we more and more become non-attached to all that which gets in the way, as we enter into that groundless ground and come to confront that godless Godhead, it's out of our being grounded there that the life of the true Mary and Martha take place. In other words, it's out of that ground that we speak to the world, that we preach, teach, do works of mercy. And I want to emphasize now that word mercy, because, interestingly enough, and in one way, one of the writers about Eckhart years ago entitled his work, Cyprian Smith entitled his work, The Way of Paradox. To really get at Eckhart, one has to accept the nature of his language, of his speech, and how paradoxical it is, at least in the sermons. Anyway, although God is nameless, we've said there is no name for God. In the end, there is a name, a word that Eckhart will use, and that word is mercy. So let me read from one of his other sermons. And again, the nature of preaching, of speech in that kind of setting will always depend upon those to whom you're preaching, those to whom you speak. So it's not as if it's an inconsistency in Eckhart, but in this occasion, it might be that this is what's necessary for these. And sometimes in his sermons, he will refer to, you heard me speak last time at St. Maccabees, which was one of the places where he had often preached in Strasbourg. And so he might emphasize or build upon, or in another place see the need to emphasize something else. So here he says, a master says, again, he's talking about himself, a master says the highest work that God ever performed in creatures is mercy. In other words, the most noble thing that God does is mercy. And I think of the most recent book written by Cardinal Walter Casper entitled Mercy. Again, a very significant emphasis in the maturity of his own thought that Casper emphasizes that notion. Eckhart continues, the most secret and hidden work that God performed, even in regard to the angels, is borne up in mercy. It is the work of mercy, as it is in itself and as it is in God. In other words, what may have seemed abstract, confusing, incomprehensible, in much of what we've said, in the end now, we want to come, as we bring these conferences to a close, to say that the practical side is not only that of letting go and detaching and growth in humility and entering into the ground, and yet out of that ground being people who share what comes to us in the ground with the world, so that we need our merry moments, but we also are to be Marthas in that sense, active in the world. Well, what is that in the world all about except mercy? He continues, whatever God performs, that is, whatever God does, its first breaking forth is mercy. Not in the sense of his forgiving our sins, although that's there, but that's not what he's talking about, forgiveness of sin, or one person showing mercy to another, but I mean the highest work that God does is mercy. A master, again himself, says the work of mercy is so akin to God. In other words, although God can't be described, can't be understood, can't be named, nevertheless, mercy is so much like God that though truth, riches, and goodness are names for God, one of them names it better than the other. So, can you hold those two things together? In one way, from one perspective, apophatically speaking, God is nameless. On the other hand, if you want cataphatically speaking, that is the capacity to say something about God that is true rather than false, we can name God as truth, as goodness. But he says one of these names God better than the other. God's highest work is mercy. And this means that God places the soul in the highest and purest place that she can attain, and there God works mercy. So what is God doing in the soul? One, giving birth to his word, but in giving birth to his word, God also is there, he says, almost like in a bottomless ocean are his words. There God works mercy. Now, we have to put this for a moment in the context of many disputes in the history of Christian thought and spirituality, especially disputes between Dominicans and Franciscans that emerged at a certain time, not to overemphasize that, but that the Dominican tradition tended to emphasize that foundationally speaking, that which is most basic is intellect. That in a sense, we can't love God unless we know God. And so it's knowledge of God, God as truth, intellect, that is the foundation. And out of that, the will and our love for God flows. Whereas a more Franciscan tradition was emphasized, especially later Franciscan traditions, the notion of will, which led to a kind of voluntarism, but the notion of will as being foundational, and the will is associated with love. So which is more important, you could ask at this point, knowing God or loving God? Well, for us today, it's a question. At that time, it was a disputed question, which is more founded. Both are necessary and important, no question of that, for whether Franciscan, Dominican, or whatever, knowing God and loving God, but which is kind of the truth in which we need to ground ourselves. Well, what Eckhart is going to say, interestingly, although he comes out of the intellectualist tradition, that is Dominican, he'll also say in one way, at this sermon at least, neither of these. It's neither knowing God or loving God as such. He says the best masters, that would be the Dominican ones, declare that intellect strips everything off of God and grasps God bare. In other words, there's something about our intellectual approach that really grasps God as ungraspable, gets God as bare, gets to the core. God as God is in himself pure being. Okay? Knowledge breaks through truth and goodness, striking on our being and taking God's bare as he is without name. In other words, there's something about knowing God as the one unknown. This gets to the heart of the matter. But he says, I say that neither knowledge nor love is that which really unites us to God. Love takes God insofar as he is good. In other words, love, it's important now, nothing more important than love of God and love of neighbor, but loving God takes God insofar as he is good. If we were to lose the name of goodness, then love couldn't go any further. In other words, it's like, and he'll use that expression, love takes God with a kind of cloak on, the cloak of goodness. It's because God is good. God is good to me, or how can one not love that which is good, the one who deserves to be loved? And so we take God under a certain guise of his goodness. Love takes God under a garment. Understanding doesn't do this. This is why understanding's a dot better. It doesn't have to take God because God is good. But understanding takes God as he is known, but it can never grasp him in the ocean of his unfathomableness. So although knowledge is a teeny bit more profound in the sense that it doesn't need that garment of goodness in order to love God, it gets at God as God is in his unknowability and his unfathomableness. But even there is a way in which understanding doesn't do the full trick, so to speak. And so he says, I say that above these two, understanding and love, there is mercy. There God works mercy in the highest and purest acts that God is capable of. So I want us to conclude our time together with the awareness that to know God is to know God as mercy. Not to know God as mercy is not to know God. And so although we can't, intellectually speaking, know God, God is nameless, we can love God, but even there, in a sense, what we love is the fact that God is so lovable. But until we really come to the awareness of God as pure mercy, which we come to in the ground of our soul, we can't say we've gone as far as we can in coming to God. In a different sermon, and let me conclude with this, he says, the more you have of God, the more you want of him. For if you could have enough of God, then God would not be God. In other words, you're never going to have enough of God. You should love God as he is. That is, as a non-God. Again, we come back to the godless God, the God beyond the God, the Godhead beyond the God. We should love God as God is, and that is as a non-God. That is one who is just is, and in that sense, we must detach ourselves from all duality and come to just be in God. And the more we enter into the ground of the soul, there we do break through into God as God breaks through into us and gives birth. And in that birth, there is only the one. There is only God, and God and I are one in God's mercy.
Thank you for listening to this program by Now You Know Media. Please visit our website, nowyouknowmedia.com, today to browse our newest programs.